Welcome to our Tuesday's broadcast of the Gospel Truth. Today I'm continuing to teach from the life of Joseph and share some truths that have just revolutionized my life. We started last week talking about that you've got to have a dream. God gave Joseph two dreams. And you don't have to have a physical dream where your eyes are closed and at night you have a dream, but you have to have a goal, a purpose. God will reveal to you that He has something more for you, and those things become like anchors that hold you and sustain you through hard times. There is going to be a time in between when the Word of God is first sown in your life and when you see the fruit come up. The Bible talks about seed, time, and harvest, and it's usually more like seed and then time and then harvest. There is a length of time. With Moses, if Moses would have just cooled his jets and have stayed in the palace, it would have been 10 years from the time that he knew God's will until it came to pass. But because of his rebellion, he spent 40 years in the wilderness, and it actually delayed the purposes of God 30 years for the entire nation. With David, it was somewhere around 13 years before he saw God's will come to pass. With Paul in the New Testament, it was 3.5 years that he spent in the desert, and then another, I forget exactly the length of time, but I think it was around 10 years from the time that he was converted before he began to start functioning as the Apostle Paul. And in every character in the Bible, you see this period of time. Joseph had God reveal His will to him when he was 17 years old, Genesis chapter 37, verse 2, and he was 30 years old when he finally stood before Pharaoh. So for 13 years, Joseph did not see God's will come into pass, but he believed it. And that's what I've been sharing. Yesterday, I spent a lot of time showing that the favor and the excellence that Joseph operated in, it says that Potiphar, his master, saw that God was with him and he put everything under his hands. That doesn't happen to a person who's not doing things with a spirit of excellence. And I spent a lot of time talking about how we have to cooperate. The favor of God is upon us, but it has to manifest itself to other people. And the way other people see it is in our way we act. It says this right here, that the master, this is in Genesis 39:3, the master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hands. This was observable in his life. He was living it. Boy, this is important. I could go back over all of that. Let me drop down to verse 8. Even though he was faithful and he had been promoted and he started out as the lowest paid slave, I don't guess you pay slaves, but the lowest slave on the rung, on the ladder, the lowest seniority, he got promoted and he ruled Potiphar's house. But Satan didn't just roll over and let this happen. This is another thing that you're going to learn through Joseph and through other people, is that just because God starts blessing you and you can see some manifestation of the power and the blessing of God, Satan is going to fight you to the end. And you can't just seek the Lord in spurts and because things start to improve, let up. You've got to stay diligent, because Satan is as a roaring lion. He's going about seeking whom he may devour, and you can't ever just coast. It's like flying in a plane. You can't ever just cut the power off and expect to get there. You're going to start sinking the moment you do. Satan is going to come against you. So here's Joseph. He had been faithful. It doesn't tell us what period of time, but I would suspect it was a year or years. And he had been faithful, but it says in verse 7, and it came to pass after these things that the master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, Lie with me. But he refused, and said unto his master's wife, Behold, my master wanteth not what is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he hath to my hand. There is none greater in his house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Man, that's powerful. Again, this is an insight into Joseph and what made him the person that he was, the way that God could use him and bless him. He felt a commitment to Potiphar, even though Potiphar would have never known about this. Boy, I pray that you're getting some of the things I'm saying right here, because our society today, our ethics are totally dependent upon what everybody else is doing, what is the norm. We've departed so far from serving God and obeying God that, the average Christian, they just kind of look in society, take an average, and they just try and be average. They aren't as bad as the terrible ungodly. They may not be as good as the very best, just as long as they're average. That's kind of the way most people think. They get their sense of morality from what the nation is doing. This program is heard all around the world. And so some of you may not have this perspective, but in the United States Supreme Court just legalized gay marriage and said basically that it's okay, it's not immoral anymore. And there's amazing how many Christians just go along with whatever's said. If they were to legalize murder, if they were to legalize adultery and having multiple wives or bestiality, there's a lot of Christians that just go along with it. They do not get their standard of right and wrong from God and from His Word. But that is totally wrong. Did you know Joseph could have rationalized this and have thought, you know what? I was a slave. I've been denied all of these things. I was sold into slavery. No, who's going to tell on me? The master's wife wasn't going to tell on him because she would have been involved in this adultery and it would have been her own neck on the line. He could have rationalized this and thought, nobody's going to know. Therefore, in the eyes of a lot of people, if you can get by with it, then it's not wrong. I read a thing in Reader's Digest where they actually put a billfold on the sidewalk, put $100 in it. They put in contact information, address, telephone number, all that kind of stuff. And they did this as a test to see what the morality of the American public would be. And so they put this billfold with $100 in it on the sidewalk. And then they hid and they watched to see what people did. And I forget the exact figures now, but it was over 50%. It was somewhere around 60 or 70% of the people picked up the billfold, looked at it, they saw all of the contact information, but then they would look around. And if they couldn't see anybody, if they thought nobody was watching, they would just take the money and throw the billfold back down. And after Reader's Digest did this, they were watching when the person took the money and just started to walk off. Then they would come and they'd stop them and they said, we put this there. This was a test. You had contact information in there. Why didn't you seek to return the money? And without exception, the people would just say, well, I didn't think anybody was watching. I didn't realize that anybody would know. And so basically, since they wouldn't get caught, that meant that it was okay. That's wrong. Just because a society changes and legalizes gay marriage and says that bestiality is okay and starts saying that you don't have to be faithful to your wife, and because that's the way the movies portray it and television and on, that should not affect your standard of what's right and wrong. You ought to have an absolute standard. And just like those verses I was using on our program yesterday out of Ephesians chapter 6, the Lord says, don't serve your masters with eye service as man-pleasers, but do it heartily as unto the Lord. It doesn't matter if people at work ever know that you snuck in 5 minutes late, you leave 5 minutes early, that you've taken things from the business. It doesn't matter if you can get by with it or not. Is that the way that God would want you to serve? If you were the boss, is that the way you would want your employees to serve you? See, you need to do things as unto the Lord. And this is one of the characteristics of Joseph. Joseph felt a commitment to his master. His master trusted him. And because of that, he wasn't going to break that trust. I tell you, people don't understand how important people's trust is with you. There's people that will do things behind the scenes and violate people's trust because they think they can get by with it. But you should never do that. I had people come to me who, I won't mention this other minister's name, but they had written a letter for another well-known minister and got him $22 million off of that one letter that they sent to his mailing list. Now, my ministry was a lot smaller at that time, and they couldn't guarantee me $22 million, but they said, we will guarantee you $1 million if you'll let us send out this letter if you'll buy our services and send out this letter. And I read the letter because, man, I could have sure used $1 million. So I read it to see what they were saying, and they were saying I had orphanages. They had pictures of babies with swollen bellies and flies on their face and stuff, and saying that I had done all these things. And I said, but those things are not true. And they said it wasn't true about this other ministry you wrote it for, but it still got them money. Says it doesn't matter how you get it. You just take it and then you use it however you want to, but this will get you money. And I said, no, I kicked these people out of my office. I said, I'm not going to violate this. You know, one of the reasons that we do prosper is because I have gone out of my way to never cry wolf to our partners. Man, my partners trust that if I say we're in a situation we need some money, they believe me because I don't sit there and I don't lie to them. I'm candid about it. You know, I went to another major ministry, a television ministry, and a guy took me into a room. It was a huge room, and they had letters stacked up to the ceiling. And I said, what are these? And he said, these are our crisis letters for 3 years in advance. They hadn't had the crisis yet. There was no crisis, but they had written it, and they justified it by saying, if we don't send out these letters and proclaim that there's a crisis, then we're going to have it. And so they just tried and cut it off, and they proclaimed, they made up these crises, and that's how they raised money. And because of this, people have gotten to where they don't trust a lot of media ministers because they know that they will manipulate and lie and twist things in order to get money out of people. I'm telling you, you can't do stuff like that. Joseph would not break the trust that he had with Potiphar. And here's the real kicker. Here's the main thing. After he had mentioned all of these things about how Potiphar had trusted him and all of this, he said, how could I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Even though he took into account Potiphar and he had to be faithful to his master and all those kind of things, and that's a part of it, the bottom line has to be that you are doing things to God and not to man. You are not a man pleaser. You aren't just doing things and seeing what you can get by with. You are going to serve God faithfully. You know, I spoke in a school in Kansas City one time. Had over 500 children in this school, and while I was waiting to speak, they gave me some brochures, pamphlets about this school, and the main thing that they were advertising was positive peer pressure. And they were saying that because it was a Christian school, that the children were pressured by their peers to seek God, to pray, to study the Word, to do this, and they were advertising positive peer pressure. And I understand to a degree. Parenting is hard, and sometimes you want to use everything possible. And man, if you could put your kids in a place where everybody's loving God and that's a positive peer pressure, then I'm not saying that I wouldn't do something like that. But I think at its core, that's still the wrong thing, because you're still training your children to respond to what everybody else is doing. Something even better than positive peer pressure is personal relationship with God, to where the kid is responsible to God and aware that God is evaluating everything regardless of what anybody else does. If you were training your children to just go with the flow, what would happen if you put them in a situation where everything is ungodly around them? Like in my situation, I was raised in a Christian home. I had Christian friends and everything was good, but then I got drafted and sent to Vietnam, and I guarantee you, in Vietnam, man, people were doing things that they would have never have done in the States, because they would have been embarrassed, they would have been exposed, their friends, their family would have known about it. But in Vietnam, nobody was ever going to find out about the stuff that you did. You know, we had a stand down every 90 days is what they call it, and you'd go back to the rear area, and they would bring the troops out of the field, and they would put them in this rear area on the beach. In my division, it was Chu Lai, Vietnam. And they would give you free booze, and they would bring in these showgirls who, technically, it was a musical show, but the truth was they were all prostitutes. And they'd bring in these girls, and they'd give you all the free sex and the booze for 3 days that you could handle. And in my company, there was 200 people. And as far as I know, I am the only person out of 200 that didn't participate. Now, the peer pressure over there was all bad. And even I was a chaplain's assistant. One of my chaplains actually got drunk and got up on the stage and tried to have sex with one of the showgirls and stuff. And so I was the only person out of this whole group that wasn't participating. And I tell you, there was peer pressure. I remember standing outside in the dark on the beach watching everybody else inside with this show going on. And it was just like a magnet drawing me. And I was thinking, man, everybody else is in there having this great time and stuff. And it was a pressure on me. But you know what kept me from doing it? It wasn't because I couldn't have gotten away with it. I could have participated in that and come home and just have never told anybody. You know, this is just andiology. This is my own personal opinion. I know that a lot of people will disagree with this. But I think that a lot of PTSD isn't just the torments of war and the physical things about seeing people maimed and stuff like that. But in war, the typical soldier indulges in stuff just like what I was describing. You know, with prostitutes, dope, alcohol. They do things that they would have never have done back in the world where they were accountable to a husband or a wife or a family, father or mother or sister or brother or friends. And they do stuff that just is eating them up on the inside. And they come home and they may talk about the battle and about these things. And again, that's part of it. But I think that there's a lot of guilt over all the things that were done. I actually went through Vietnam with a guy who we were raised together. We grew up in the same church. We only lived just a few blocks apart from each other. We weren't best friends, but we had known each other our entire life. And we went through Vietnam together. And this guy, even though we were raised in the same church, went to the same church, he had the same background, he submitted to that stuff. And to this day, this guy's still messed up, wearing his boonie hat and still doing, I mean, he's just reliving Vietnam 40, 50 years later, whatever it is. And I can guarantee you a large part of it is because of the immoral stuff that he got into. This is so powerful right here. Joseph couldn't have been caught. The wife wouldn't have squealed on him. He could have justified it. Well, I was unjustly treated here. I deserve this. You know, Joseph was 17 years old in Genesis chapter 37 when God gave him these dreams and when his brothers sold him into slavery. We can assume that he was a virgin. And here he was in a situation. This was an opportunity for him. He could have rationalized this in 1,000,001 ways and have said, I deserve it. Who's going to know? His parents would never know about it because they thought he was dead. His brothers had sold him into slavery. Who was ever going to know? He was in a foreign land. But you know the thing that kept him straight? He says, how could I do this great wickedness and sin against God? I can tell you that that's exactly what kept me on course when I went through Vietnam and was the only person who wasn't participating in this stuff. It was because I had a personal relationship with God. This is what kept me anchored to the vision that God had put in my heart about reaching multitudes of people and not giving up during these hard times. Is because of my personal relationship with God. And I'm telling you, brothers and sisters, some of you right now, you know that God has more for you than what you're experiencing. You desire more. You may pray for it and look for it, but are you holding faithful? Are you standing there? Is your personal relationship with God strong? Or are you just doing what you can get by with? There's a lot of people, see, that want to be faithful over these big things, but you've never been faithful in little. That's what Luke chapter 16 says. You won't be promoted unto much until you're faithful with that which is little. Unless you've served another man and have been faithful to serve him, who's going to commit to you your own things? If you really want to become the CEO of a company, you need to start being the custodian of somebody else's company and be the best custodian. You work hard, and as you get promoted and come up through the ranks, as you've been faithful in these levels, well then God will send you somebody who will be faithful to you in those levels. You know, in the ministry I see this, that there's people who want to be a pastor of a 1,000-member church, but they won't be a faithful youth director. They won't sit there and clean the toilets. They won't clean the church. They won't do these things. They're waiting until they get there in front of, thousands of people, and then they're going to be faithful. If you won't be faithful in a smaller thing, you won't be faithful in greater things. You've got to have a personal relationship with God that regardless of whether anybody else is watching you or not, you've got to be doing everything that you do. If you're the janitor, do it with all of your heart. If you're the one that's mowing the lawn, do it with all of your heart. If you're the one that's the errand boy, you do it with all of your heart. You do everything the best that you possibly can. And I guarantee you, if you do that, it'll be just like Joseph. Now Joseph, he remained faithful to God, and instead of him immediately getting the reward, his Potiphar's wife got angry at him. Because he had denied her this sexual relationship, she actually lied about him. Before I get into that, let me just go on and say some other things right here. He said in verse 9, "How could I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" But she just kept after him. It says in verse 10, "And it came to pass, as she spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie by her or to be with her." Boy, this shows great integrity on his part. There's a lot of people that they don't want to go out and commit sin, but they will put themselves in a position where they could be compromised. In our ministry, I am convinced that I'm going to be faithful to my wife. I love God. I love my wife. We're going on our 44th year of marriage, and I've been faithful this whole time. I make no plans to do anything differently. But did you know what? I don't put myself in situations where I could be pressured or compromised. I'm not going to go into some kind of a situation. I'm not going to allow myself to be tempted. The Bible says to resist the devil, but it also says to flee temptation. A lot of people are trying to resist temptation, but flee from the devil. You can't flee from the devil. You got to stand and fight him. And likewise, you are not supposed to put yourself in situations where you can be tempted. You avoid them. Joseph would not lie with her. He wouldn't have sexual relationship with her, but he also wouldn't even be with her unless it was absolutely part of his job. But he avoided her. Wisdom on his part. Boy, there are some people that are putting themselves in situations that you shouldn't be in. That's not wisdom. You shouldn't do that. But anyway, it came to pass in verse 11, about this time, that Joseph went into the house to do his business, and there was none of the men of the house there within, and she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." And he left his garment in her hand and fled and got him out. Again, this reveals his attitude. I'm out of time. I'm going to have to continue this on my program tomorrow. Please get these materials. I guarantee you they'll bless you. And join me again tomorrow as we continue the gospel truth.